Generally, these profound harmonies seem to me like those stimulants that quicken the pulse of the imagination, a comparison essentially with drug taking. Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I've just played a wonderful piece for piano by Richard Wagner, The Arrival of the Black Swans, which was a piece that he wrote in 1861 for a lady called Countess Maria de Portales. She was married to the Prussian ambassador, and they lived in this grand house in the middle of Paris, where they had a couple of swans who lived in the pond there, and Wagner would look at these swans. He loved swans all his life. There's a famous swan, of course, in Lohengrin, and there's another swan scene in Parsifal. So these are birds that meant a lot to him, and the black swan that possibly had a symbolic meaning for him because he'd had a very bad year. I'll tell you about that in a moment. And the piano piece reflects the sort of poetic scene where you encounter these beautiful creatures in the garden. And he was in Paris, 1861. I'm recording all this in quite a hurry, actually, because we're about to go off to Inverness. I've reorchestrated for chamber orchestra the entirety of Wagner's Parsifal, and it's going to get performed in Inverness next week. So Wagner's very much on my mind. Also today, I believe, is Wagner's 213th birthday, so it feels like the right time to be releasing this video. And Wagner's not celebrated for his piano music, but in fact, and you can hear in the piece I've just played, his piano music, there's very little of it. Just a few album leaves, just pieces that he wrote for friends and patronesses and so on. This is an example. But there's this wonderful sonority, this magnificent Wagnerian harmony. This is music that was written after Tristan and Isolde, and you can hear a link, can't you, with the marvellous third act of Tristan. You'll remember how that begins. With these fantastic sort of dark cadences in F minor. And something of the same spirit is in this wonderful piano piece where you get the threefold repetition. And there's that sense of travelling through space, of travelling towards something. He'll start loud and move away from it, or vice versa. So there's this wonderful sense. I can't think of any other music in the 19th century that has that sense of moving towards or away. Great dramatist that he is, he brings that into his piano writing. And no, it's not virtuosic, which is probably why it isn't played much. But actually, this is music that stands very strong comparison with music by Liszt that was written at the same sort of period. Of course, both Wagner and Liszt were friends. Wagner was soon, at the end of the decade, to become Liszt's son-in-law. So very close bond between them. They knew each other's music very well, but there's something absolutely individual about Wagner's piano writing in this wonderful poetic piece. Let me tell you one more thing, though, before I rush off to Inverness. 1861, Wagner was essentially licking his wounds. He was on his own in Paris, staying in the Prussian embassy, looking at the Black Swans, licking his wounds because he had just created a new version of Tannhäuser. Tannhäuser was an old opera and a popular opera in Germany, but it was the first time it was performed in Paris, and Wagner had hoped to make a huge splash in the city with a run of 10 performances. As it turned out, it was a catastrophe. Wagner wrote magnificent ballet music for Act 1. He refused to write music for Act 2, which was what the Paris Opera required of him, but he said, I can't write a ballet for Act 2 because Act 2 is a song contest. But at the beginning of the opera, there's this fantastic scene on top of the Venusberg where the goddess Venus is surrounded by naiads and dryads and all these wonderful supernatural voluptuous beings. Let's do the Bacchanal. So a very kind of ecstatic and frenzied ballet score is the result. In Wagner's post-Tristanesque style, it's really wild. It's even got castanets in the orchestra. The trouble was that the Paris Opera tradition was that you had a ballet in Act 2. And the Jockey Club, which was a club consisting entirely of Parisian aristocrats, were in the habit of turning up to operas in the second act. So they would dine late, they'd turn up for the second act, they'd watch their mistresses dancing in the ballet in Act 2, and everything went along like that. And Wagner, as usual, disrupted that tradition. He put the ballet at the beginning of the opera. The Jockey Club turned up to watch the ballet in Act 2, and there was no ballet it had already happened in Act 1, and so they protested violently, booing and shouting. And this was an illustrious audience. Napoleon III was there, the court were all assembled, you know, it was a very cultural event, and the Jockey Club disrupted the entire performance. On the second night, there was some hope that things would improve, but no, the Jockey Club returned, indignant about what Wagner had done. They brought whistles this time, which they called Wagner whistles, and they hooted and whistled away throughout the performance. The same thing happened on the third night, and Wagner withdrew the rest of the performances. He'd had enough. So what a catastrophe. And he never came back to Paris, that was it. He returned to Germany, and often in Cosima Wagner's diary, you notice that his comments about Paris and France tend to be, you know, pretty chauvinistic. He's pretty anti-French. Lots of angry, bitter comments about the trivialities of Paris. However, 1861 was also the time when the great Charles Baudelaire, the French poet and a huge cultural figure of the latter half of the 19th century, came to hear Wagner conduct concert items in a performance in Paris, and he was so bowled over that he wrote Wagner a letter, a sort of fan letter. So let me read some of the things that Baudelaire said in his fan letter to Richard Wagner. Dear Sir, I've always imagined that however used to fame a great artist may be, he cannot be insensible to a sincere compliment, especially when that compliment is like a cry of gratitude. And finally, that this cry could acquire a singular kind of value when it came from a Frenchman, which is to say from a man little disposed to be enthusiastic and born moreover in a country where people hardly understand painting and poetry any better than they do music. First of all, I want to tell you that I owe you the greatest musical pleasure I've ever experienced. I've reached an age when one no longer makes it a pastime to write letters to celebrities, and I should have hesitated a long time before writing to express my admiration for you. If I did not daily come across shameless and ridiculous articles in which every effort is made to libel your genius, you are not the first man, sir, about whom I have suffered and blushed for my country. At length, indignation impelled me to give you an earnest of my gratitude. I said to myself, I want to stand out from all those imbeciles. The first time I went to the Italian theatre in order to hear your works, I was rather unfavourably disposed, and indeed, I must admit, full of nasty prejudices. But I have an excuse. I've been so often duped. I have heard so much music by pretentious charlatans. But you conquered me at once. What I felt is beyond description, and if you'll be kind enough not to laugh, I shall try to interpret it for you. At the outset, it seemed to me that I knew this new music, and later on, thinking it over, I understood whence came this mirage. It seemed to me that this music was mine, and I recognised it in the way that any man recognises the things he's destined to love. To anybody but an intelligent man, this statement would be immensely ridiculous, especially when it comes from one who, like me, does not know music. So Baudelaire was not a musician. But so many people who've heard Wagner, fallen in love with Wagner's music. I've had this experience as a teenager. It feels absolutely familiar when you hear it for the first time, although it sounds like nothing else. There's something wonderfully personal and intimate about his music. He says a couple of other beautiful things, and then I promise I will stop. The thing that struck me, says Baudelaire, the most was the character of grandeur. It depicts what is grand and incites to grandeur. Throughout your works, I found again the solemnity of the grand sounds of nature in her grandest aspects, as well as the solemnity of the grand passions of man. One feels immediately carried away and dominated. Fantastic description of what Wagner's music is like, the sort of immensity of it. Baudelaire carries on, generally these profound harmonies seem to me like those stimulants that quicken the pulse of the imagination, a comparison essentially with drug taking. He was an opium addict, and yes, Nietzsche said this too, Wagner's music is a bit like a drug. There is everywhere something rapt and enthralling, something aspiring to mount higher, something excessive and superlative. For example, if I may make analogies with painting, let me suppose I have before me a vast expanse of dark red. If this red stands for passion, I see it gradually passing through all the transitions of red and pink to the incandescent glow of a furnace. It would seem difficult, impossible even, to reach anything more glowing, and yet a last fuse comes and traces a whiter streak on the white of the background. This will signify, if you will, the supreme utterance of a soul and its highest paroxysm. So all this stuff about colour and richness, it's kind of familiar to those of us who admire Wagner's music, but I love the detail he goes into there. And he finishes up by saying, "From the day when I heard your music, I've said to myself endlessly, and especially at bad times, if I only could hear a little Wagner tonight. There are doubtless other people constituted like myself. Once again, sir, I thank you. You brought me back to myself and to what is great in some unhappy moments." Charles Baudelaire. And so that is the ultimate fan letter, Baudelaire to Wagner. Let me know what you think. Oh, and before I go, thank you for those of you who support the channel. Please like and subscribe. Consider becoming a patron if you want to. Also feel free to comment liberally on our videos, and there are a lot of videos on the channel now, so please check out others. There are lots about Wagner. This is one of many. And I'll see you when I get back from Inverness, which will be sometime next week. Bye.